Hi, I'm Richard Atkinson. This video will discuss the Ingenious Fugal finale of Mozart's K387 G major quartet. I've already discussed in other videos the more famous Fugal finale from his Jupiter Symphony, and the probably less famous but similarly amazing Fugal finale from his K593 D major quintet. Unlike these other two fugal movements, the finale of the K387 quartet begins at the outset with a fugato involving this subject consisting of 4 whole notes, foreshadowing the more famous 4-note motif that begins the final movement of the Jupiter Symphony. As the subject cycles through all 4 parts, notice that the answers in the dominant are tonal answers, meaning that they are not exact transpositions of the original subject. That would be termed a real answer, but slightly adjust the intervals between the notes to conform to the original key. In the case of this particular subject, a real answer would result in continued modulations around the circle of fifths. You'll see an example of this actually occurring later in the development section. A syncopated countersubject also cycles through 3 of the parts, while a second countersubject consisting of leaps occurs in 2 of the parts. Finally, a third countersubject appears only once in the second violin part. This movement is one of the finest examples of the much written about duality in the classical style of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, between the learned style of complex, dense counterpoint and the popular style of homophonic melodies with subjugated accompaniment. Mozart juxtaposes these two styles to an almost gleeful degree in this movement, beginning by immediately following the initial complicated fugato we just heard, with a relatively homophonic transitional passage that eventually modulates to the dominant to introduce the second theme of this sonata form movement. The second theme in the dominant key of D major is also a fugato based on this new subject. Notice that the answers are again tonal answers that are not exact transpositions. After the new subject cycles through all the parts, it is suddenly spectacularly combined with the original whole note subject in a double fugato, which cycles again through all 4 parts. Mozart now hilariously contrasts the serious business of this complicated double fugato with an amazingly frivolous homophonic closing theme played by the first violin. When the theme is repeated as an even more flippant staccato variant, Mozart ensures the performers understand his desired effect with a marking of semplice, or simple, under the first violin part. The exposition section ends and transitions to its repeat, and the second time to the development section, with this seemingly unimportant ascending chromatic scale in the second violin part, which now becomes an important motif in the development section, and again later in the coda. It enters imitatively in each of the parts to form a modulatory section that prepares for the eventual entrance of the original whole note subject in B-flat minor, accompanied this time by a new countermotif. The whole note subject alternates between the first violin and the cello, and since each entry is an exact transposition of the previous one, it cycles through the circle of fifths, as I explained it would earlier, modulating from B-flat minor to F minor to C minor and to G minor. The new countermotif now takes over, preparing us for the key of C major. The first homophonic material from the exposition that we highlighted in orange now returns in C major, the subdominant key of the movement. What constitutes the beginning of the recapitulation section is ambiguous in this sonata movement, since here we have an obvious break, and this material from the exposition progresses in a recapitulatory fashion, even though the tonic key of G major has not yet returned. During the exposition, this material had functioned to modulate from G major to the dominant key of D major. Now it similarly modulates from C major back to the tonic key of G major. The separate fugatos from the exposition never return in the recapitulation, but instead the combined double fugato now appears to re-establish the key of G major. However, this time it begins with the tonal answers in the dominant key of D major and is answered by the original subjects in the tonic key of G major. If one defines the beginning of the recapitulation as the moment at which the tonic finally returns, which I don't think makes any sense in this case, it would be at this moment, after the double fugato has already begun. The fugato now takes a surprising turn with this sudden entry in E-flat major, accompanied by a new hammering rhythmic motif, before returning to the tonic. The recapitulation section ends with the hilarious closing theme, this time introduced by an amusing rising figure in the first violin part. The semplice variant also returns, but this time in a comically high register, adding to the silliness of the moment. The coda begins by once again using imitative entries of the chromatic motif, leading to the contrapuntal climax of the movement, when the original whole note subject enters in a remarkable four-part stretto. Stretto is the fugal term for when the entries of the subject are squeezed together such that the later entry begins before the earlier has finished. Here, the second violin enters only a half note after the first violin, giving the stretto a syncopated, off-kilter quality, while the viola and cello answer at the distance of one measure. Notice that the first violin, viola, and cello parts have trills on the final note of the subject. Mozart now ends the movement with perhaps the most contrasting juxtaposition yet, answering one of the most contrapuntally complex moments of the piece, with an almost tauntingly simple homophonic statement of the original subject.